chapter 4. We're not going to restudy it, but just some of these highlights. Notice Paul says we have this treasure in earthen vessels. What treasure is he talking about? I'm sorry? Yeah. Our soul. Okay. Maybe we need to go back and teach the class again. Yeah. I'm sorry? The gospel. All right? And that's what's amazing. This beautiful treasure that can save people, and it's embedded in or carried around in earthen vessels, meaning our bodies. Now, why does Paul say that God intended to do that? So the greatness and the power would be of God and not from ourselves. Now, what do we know about clay pots or earthen vessels? They're fragile. And that's really the theme that he's going to be talking about. We're fragile. You know, we're here for just a little while, then we're gone. We're subject to being growing age and having problems, especially then when you're persecuted. That complicates everything. It compounds your fragility that you have. And so he says, we're afflicted in every way, but not crushed. We're perplexed, but not despairing. We're persecuted, but not forsaken. We're struck down, but not destroyed. But sometimes as an earthen vessel, you feel that way. Now, especially Paul, because in chapter 11, he'll talk about his life as a preacher of the gospel. And it was horrific in many ways, that beaten and stoned and shipwrecked and whipped and going hungry, persecutions from within and without. But he says we're always carrying about in the body the dying of Jesus. And the life of Jesus also be manifest in our body. Colossians 1, he talks about we're bearing the scars or the brands of Jesus Christ. Did Paul suffer for being a preacher of the gospel? Yes, more than you and I could ever imagine. But he says that's okay, because look what he says. Now, here's my question. What moves a person like you or I or Paul to speak out regardless of the personal suffering that he's going to encounter? What's his motivation? Now, notice some of the words that we see in this book of 2 Corinthians by itself. He says, I believe, therefore I spoke. There's going to be the big thing. Why did he keep speaking? He's convicted of it. When you know something be true and you're absolutely convicted and you're passionate about it, you're going to talk about it. People always talk about the things they believe in, the things that are important to them. When you get older, what do you talk about other than your deteriorating health? Grandchildren. Why are we so passionate about grandchildren? Because they're so wonderful. And you'll talk about them to anyone that wants to listen, and even if they don't want to listen, right? All right? So Paul says there's something about the gospel, and he's really quoting what we see this text in Psalm 16. I believe, therefore I spoke, and I'm greatly afflicted. Just can't keep your mouth shut because you know this is true, so you have to say something. So this is for the young people as well as those of us who are still working out our salvation. Find something you're passionate about, you know, in life, but more importantly, be convicted of the Scripture. Be convinced. And then you're going to be bold and confident about it. And there will be none of this hesitation. Be convicted. And then when you can say, I believe, you're going to speak. Because he says we have confidence that Jesus will raise us also with Jesus. God will raise us with Jesus. He'll present us with you. So when we look at all these things, he says, verse 16, that's the last verse in this chapter. Therefore, we don't lose heart, grow weary, and give up. Even though our outer man is decaying. Now, is that the life of all of us up there? You look in the mirror and you go, what happened? I mean, for a while you started getting better looking, but then you go over the hill and then you start, well, what is his word? Decaying. Face is falling apart. Right? I'm sorry? Well, yeah, but well, thank you. But let's be brutally honest. Your body starts decaying. Who was I talking today? They're thinking they need to get knee surgery. Who was that? Oh, it's my good friend in Ollie. He said, the doctor said, you know, you're going to need it, but I can just give you some shots for a while. And he goes, why should I get shots if I'm going to get it later? I might as well get it now. So people replace body parts. Because why? Because you're decaying, all right? And it's all right, but it's natural. But Paul says it's compensated because the inner man is what? Something's going on simultaneously as your body deteriorates. Something spiritually is being renewed and invigorated. And that's going to be really our clue here. It's the temporal versus the eternal. This body is very temporal. We know it. We have to just swallow and learn to accept it. But because we're living for the eternal. And that's going to be chapter 5, verse 1 through 10. But notice how he describes life in the flesh. Now, he's not just talking about anyone just normally growing old and having physical pains. He's talking about the life of a Christian and suffering. You understand that? Now, we can transfer it and minimize it just like, you know, just normal aches and pains of anyone. And you could make that application, but he's talking about people that are suffering as a Christian. He says, this momentary and light affliction. What two things you learn about it? It's for a what? A little while, momentary. And then it's what? Light. Now, that's interesting. When you're suffering for any cause, no matter what it is, at the moment, does it ever feel light? No, it feels heavy and like, I don't know how I'm going to get through this. But Paul says in the big picture, in the big perspective, it's for a little while and it's really light, okay? And it's producing an eternal weight. So if you're putting a scale, you know, where you have, you know, balance beam, here is the momentary and light, and then what do you have on the other side? An eternal weight. So poof, the scale goes like this, right? How heavy is it? The glory that we're going to receive just makes this look like, you know, a bunch of fluff, or I was going to say goose down. It's so light and insignificant compared to the glory that we're going to get. Yes?
Paul actually uses that verbiage in Romans 8:18. He says, it's not even something you can compare with.
Not worthy to be compared. Here he compares it on a scale, but there he says, it's not even worth doing. Exactly. All right? So, it's far, far beyond all comparison. While we look at things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen, for the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. So here's what our goal is tonight. Start thinking spiritually eternal and not just temporal. Now, life is dominated by the temporal. And as you get older, getting out of bed's harder. And so you're locked into thinking what? From the moment you get out of bed, temporal, physical, right? And then the first thing you want is that cup of coffee. And it's, again, physical, just to get your body going. And then after you get your coffee, you want to go take a nap in your recliner. All right? What? You can't have the coffee or the nap. All right. Now, we could go with this for a long time, right? But that's what Paul is dealing with. How did Paul manage himself? He said, out of much affliction. And then in chapter 1, verse 5, just as of ours in abundance. He says, you're not aware of our affliction. In chapter 6, we have endurance in afflictions and hardship and distresses. Chapter 12, verse 10, I'm well content with weaknesses, insults, distresses, persecution, and difficulties for Christ's sake, right? So again, this is not just growing old, it's all for Christ. And he says, this is momentary and light. So the question is, Paul, how did you manage under this heavy load that you're bearing, and you just call it what? Light. How did you manage? How do you get this perspective? And here he says, I'm overflowing with joy in all our affliction. Paul, not only did you manage, you transcended the suffering and you've turned it into what? Joy. Now, can we get there? Do you think we can? In no longer being a victim, but a victor? Isn't that what it's really talking about? We're not someone that's trampled upon, where someone is failing. The key is in the next question, or what we're going to see in chapter 5, he says, we're of good courage. Why are you of good courage? You're bold and strong. Now, someone hand their hand up. I think I missed them. All right, that's my introduction. Now we're going to look at chapter 5, verse 1. All right, notice how he begins. He says, for we know. In that verse, chapter 5, verse 1? For we know. Now, frankly, a lot of people don't know what Paul says we know. Or else they know it, but they haven't considered it and let it digest and sink in and become part of who they are. But Paul says, we know. We have this understanding that the rest of the world doesn't. And since we get it, it gives us good courage. We're okay. We have this inner peace because of what we know. Well, what is it, Paul, you know? What is it? Well, let's read it. We'll talk about it. Verse 1 through 4. For we know that if the earthly tent, which is our house, is torn down, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For indeed in this house we groan, longing to be clothed with our dwelling from heaven. Inasmuch as having put it on, we shall not be found naked. For indeed, while we are in this tent, we groan, being burdened, because we do not want to be unclothed, but to be clothed, in order that which is mortal may be swallowed up by life. Verse 5, the last one. Now he who prepared us for this very purpose is God, who gave us the Spirit as a pledge. All right, so let's break these verses down because we've heard it, but there's so much packed into every verse. And so we use a picture of a house that's falling apart, right? You know, you go out, especially in ghost towns or out in the country, and you see this kind of picture often. And I'm always moved by it because I know someone lived there and they had their own life, their own dreams, their own families. They sweat like you and I did. They remodeled. When they got their wood burning kitchen stove, right? They thought, yeah, we've already upgraded, you know, a ceramic. This is top notch. And then when they finally got plumbing inside where they could move a bathroom in, weren't they living like the rich folks now? And now as things go on, this is the way their house looks. Now that's not just all our lives on this earth, that's our body, right? But Paul's talking about suffering spiritually as well to make this burden even more so. But he doesn't use a house, he says tent. And then he contrasts this tent with a house made without hands. And so let's look at some of the words. The word earthly tent is actually the word tabernacle, and that's important because there's an allusion to Israel that came out of Egyptian captivity. And not only did they live in tents, what was the house of God made up of? It was a traveling tent. Now later, it became a permanent place when they built the temple. House. And remember David? He just said, something's wrong here. I'm living in a royal palace, but our God is living in a tent. He should have his own house. He said, no, because you've shed too much blood, but your son Solomon will build it. Did he have the right attitude? God should live in a permanent dwelling, a house. Now, I want you to see that because one was temporary. It was very temporal. It provided the needs while you're passing through, but when you settle down in the promised land, God should be in a permanent house, not a tent. And it's not by coincidence. Earthly tent, which is our home, don't think house, is torn down. What does torn down mean? Torn down. How is your earthly tent going to be torn down? Death. All right, so now we've identified what is our earthly tent. It's our body. He calls it a tent, not a house. It's not permanent. You got it. It's the temporal versus the eternal. Now, this is flies in the face of the way we think generally in our life. We think this body is our home, period. And we got to take care of it at all costs. Now, as a steward, we want to, because the only thing we have to use for the Lord, it's the only way we can function is with our body. So take care of it. It is a temple of the Spirit, but it is temporal, and Paul looks at it as a tent. So can we say we're just camping? We're just camping. He said, what? Well, when you go out camping, what do you live in? Well, that's not even fair today. Because some of the motorhomes and RVs are nicer than people's houses right back then, weren't they? But let's just eschew that whole thing and just, if you were truly camping, what would you live in while you're out in the woods? In a tent. And it's lots of fun, right? All right, it looks like that, right? And you don't bring all the luxuries of life. You don't worry about it because you know you're there just for a little while. True? All right. Now, when we were in the Philippines, often you want to know how we did it. They took very good care of us. It was all comfortable. And I can say that is because Dave is just like us. He's been in a lot of elk camps. When you go camping or backpacking or tenting, where we stayed was comfortable because we've been camping. And it was better than camping, right? Is that true?
Except when I was on the floor.
But it was comfortable.
You didn't wake up with the sore legs and the back.
Well, you should have doubled your pad earlier. But it wasn't bad, all right? It was comfortable. Now, that's what he's saying here. Now, he says, we know that this body's going to die. But that's okay because we have a building. And here he uses the word house, oikos, the little word for a house in contrast to the word a tent. We have a house not made with hands. So who made it? And where is it? Is it a physical house or a spiritual? It's a spiritual one. And it's waiting for us eternal in the heavens. So here's what he says, you know. There's the physical that we're tenting in, camping for a little while. But we have our permanent home, just like God had the permanent temple. We have a permanent temple waiting for us in heaven. God's prepared it. All right? Can you see that thing? Here's the spiritual truth. The next body you're going to get is the best. You might like yours now, but you haven't seen anything yet. And you say, well, how's it going to be better? I may have a prettier nose, or I'm going to be taller, or I'm going to be more muscular. We're all thinking physically when we say those things. It's going to be better in ways that you can't even comprehend and express. We know in 1 John chapter 3 that we'll be as he is because we'll see him face to face. There's something about our spiritual nature, our glorified body, that it'll be just like God's, that we can be in his presence face to face. Now, what's interesting about this, you cannot enjoy heaven until you get your spiritual body to its fullest. Now, you can enjoy it, but in Revelation chapter 6 and chapter 7, we see people coming out of the great persecution, and they're before the throne of God who wipes their tears away. What does God give them to wear? Robes. But what's going to happen when Jesus comes again? We already studied in 1 Corinthians 15 and 1 Thessalonians 4. Jesus will descend with a shout with an archangel, and who will he bring with him? Those who have died in Christ. What are they wearing right now? Robes. Where's their body? In the ground. When they come, what will raise out of the grave? 1 Corinthians 15. A new spiritual body. It was sown physical, it'll be raised spiritual. It was sown earthly, it'll be raised heavenly. It was sown corruptible, Paul says it'll be raised incorruptible. Your next body, well, it's going to be the cat's meow. You know, it's going to be a huge upgrade. And it's going to be a permanent upgrade. It's going to be a glorified upgrade. And that's what God has designed for us. Yes?
I may be wrong on this, but I'll still throw it out. If I understand the Greek of the word building,
Yeah?
it's almost as if you're in the act of the building. It's a building that's supposed to be used for a domicile, but I think the tense of the word means that it's being built.
Right. And let me throw this at you. John chapter 3, Jesus said, if I told you earthly things you don't believe, how would you believe if I told you heavenly things? And I only show you that is, it's hard for us to get our grasp around physical things, that Jesus was God in the flesh. It's even more difficult to understand the heavenly things. But notice what he said. In my Father's house are many dwelling places. That's literally a place to stay. If it were not so, I would have told you, for I'm going to what? So what's Jesus doing for us currently right now? Building a place, a dwelling place for us. Right? Yes?
Wasn't that described when we've gone through some of the parables that the bridegroom, before he can take his bride completely to him, he had to
Right.
build and add on to his father's
Exactly.
house to prepare a place for the bride.
That's right.
And so when that was done, he would then go get
The father would tell him, go get him, your bride. That's right. That's why Jesus said, no one knows except the Father. All right? It's interesting. The Most High does not live in houses made by human hands. That's Stephen's defense in Acts 7. And that speaks of the temple, right? Was it God's literal permanent dwelling? Just in a figurative sense compared to what he did live in. Likewise, our permanent dwelling is not made by human hands. Isn't that what it says? A house not made with hands. That means it's been fashioned by God itself. It's spiritual. It's glorified. Well, that's why Paul says we know something, and that's why we're of good courage. Because when you take my life prematurely, Paul faced death so many times. He was stoned once, but shipwrecked 3 times? Whipped and beaten and starved. If you end his life prematurely, what have you done for Paul? You just sent him home early. And what has he already told us in Philippians chapter 1? I'd rather die and depart. And he said, that's much better. Because we know this. Now, there's something about our American culture that we think death is just the end of life, and really it's just the beginning. It's the beginning. When this gets torn down, only then do you have the opportunity to move into your permanent abode. And so for the Christian, we should have a whole different perspective that it's the best day of your life, the day you die. It's what we live for. And it just seems weird, but we're living to die, and we're dying to live. Figurative, we're dying. That means we have this great desire. And here is what Spurgeon says. Most people have a great fight about the future. Isn't that true? They're scared about dying. But here Paul is viewing the worst thing that could happen to him with such complacency. It's like taking a tent down. And I want you to see that picture, because what does he call your body? A tent. And what happens when you're moving from one location to another? What do you do with the tent? You take it down. Now, is that traumatic? Is that like, oh, this is so terrible, we're taking the tent down? No, it's like, let's get it out of here so we can move somewhere else and put it up again. And that's the way Paul's viewing death. It's just something as simple as taking your tent down. And he's making a shift to reside for just another little season. And that's the picture that Paul wants us to see. That's all death is. Yes?
We're packing our things to get ready for a move.
That's right. Yes?
I know it's nowhere close in comparison, but it makes me think of sister and her husband were in Southern California wanting to get into a new development. And it was such high demand, you had to camp out in line
Oh, really?
outside the office for the development to maintain your place to be able to buy one of the homes. And I helped them out by spending the night in a tent on the lawn of that. And after a few days of that, when things finally moved along, it was like, yeah, I'm really glad to get rid of this tent. Sprinklers would pop up in the morning and splash the tent and all. And it's just
That's a good picture, though. You were tenting to get into the permanent dwelling.
so they could get a
Yeah.
permanent dwelling. I'm so glad they could get out of that.
Nice. That's a good picture, yes.
And the world just does not get this. I saw a special the other day. Cryogenics.
Yeah.
Freezing
Freezing people.
people. They figure out how to make people live
Yeah.
eternally, they'll bring them back.
And when you have no God in your life and no hope, that's all your hope is to live forever on this earth, or as long as you can. And so, and again, I just have to ask that of us. Do we get it? Do we really see it? Or do we dread death? Or do we... Now, let me say this. Is there a sadness associated with death? Yes. It's because you're leaving people behind you care about, and maybe you have a lot yet still to do. Paul acknowledged that. I personally says, I lust to go to heaven, but I know that to stay is fruitful labor for you, and that's better. So he's thinking of others, and so... Do I want to leave my family yet? No. Do I want to leave my grandchildren? No. Is there work to do? Yes. But when it really comes down to it, am I ready to go to heaven? Yes. All right? Ann and others kept me abreast of Al Craig. You know, here he has Alzheimer's. He's had it for 2 years. Resigned as elder last summer. And then they had his 50th anniversary for being a preacher at Market Street in August. Then he has a major stroke, and in a week he's dead. You go, wow. Now, Al Craig was a preacher in Hillsborough when I was there as a kid. Al Craig preached a sermon, and the song was Just As I Am when I went forward to get baptized. I have a long history with Al Craig and his family, and I can't help but tell you, I was in the Philippines. I had to go in another room and cried. But it's the best day of his life. He's a warrior, and he was spared his body just falling apart, and the family had to deal with Alzheimer's. It's not a good way to die. And it's as though the Lord said, well done. I'm going to spare you the rest. I'm taking you home now. What a great way to die. A stroke, your family's around you, in a week, that's it. I'm not saying there's better ways, but was it traumatic and suffering? Now, who suffers, though, now? I feel terrible for her because Darlene's been sick, and the family, they're going to grieve, and it's going to be hard. So I don't want to minimize that at any level. But we balance it with just the glory. He said, it's not comparable. Isn't that what he says? Jeff.
I was just going to say that the group and those folks close to him echoed your sentiments, and I appreciate them too. They say that the tragedy death, those that die quickly, is of course harder on the living.
Yes. Yes.
Those who take a slow death is of course harder on the one dying, but easier on the ones that are living, because we have that time to be able to say goodbye. If you put those two worlds together, Al had a little bit of both.
Yes.
Being that he was at Market Street for 50 years, he was the preacher for over 30 full time, along with others since 2000 or so. But you put all that together and you kind of step back, and I think you mentioned this on Sunday, there's always a blessing, the
Yes.
silver lining. And again, there's others that are saying that already, so it's very comforting to see and hear that faith
Yes.
within that group and within that family. They
Yes.
recognize that, but it's still hard because it did happen quickly.
Yes.
And we all gauge that. It's one of those moments where it can change or influence others.
Yes.
Another spin-off of that is what it can lead into. And there's people that have already been influenced by that, realizing how
Yeah.
this and brevity of life can be.
That's right. But can you imagine where Al is now? Would he ever want to come back? For a second? No. Yes. Who had their hand up? Linda?
I was thinking, too, we think in our families or whatever, death is an enemy.
Yes.
It's an enemy. It's Satan's base.
Well, and that's what he said in 1 Corinthians 15. The last enemy is death, you know. That's the last one to be defeated. And it is grievous because God never intended for any of us to die. But because of sin, all will. But that's what's amazing. He has so made it work out that there's victory even in death for us. There's victory. And that's what it is. It's nothing short of victory if you're faithful to Christ. Right? Yes.
What you're saying about Al, just the other day, I called my uncle Jerry Earnhardt in Kentucky to let him know what had happened, and we had a long discussion. He's in his mid-80s, preacher, long, long time like Al, and had cancer and was not nigh unto death, but it went into remission.
Yeah.
And no, he's not a full-time preacher now. We had a discussion. Jerry, he was saying, I still see that God has work for me to do. He's still in his mid-80s teaching 3 classes a week.
That's amazing. Yeah.
The shut-ins and the sick
Yeah.
and all this kind of stuff. And I know he wants to go home to heaven and
Yeah.
be with the Lord and with his wife.
Yes.
They said, as long as I'm here and I've got work to do, he's going to do it. But I know he doesn't want to be here.
Yeah, and a lot of people know Jerry. So let's just kind of summarize what we're saying. For the family, it's tough. For the people who are in behind, Paul, when he told the elders at Ephesus, they wouldn't, no, at Caesarea. Where was it? They wept and they embraced. It was at Ephesus in Acts 20, because he said he would see their face no more. We never want to minimize that. But personally, for you, the one dying, it's the greatest day of your life. You're birthed into heaven. And you're going to get the best body you ever had. And Paul's not done. For indeed in this house we groan. Now that word groan is an interesting word. It's to sigh, it's to groan. It's used in the negative when you complain about people. You know, like someone mentions someone's name, you go, oh, right? That's a groan, okay? Well, here he's putting it in a positive while you're in this body, and that's probably Jerry, others. You groan because you just want to get out of here. I'm tired of this body, especially when it's giving out. In this house we groan. The word in this house is in italics, isn't it, in the New American Standard? Let me make sure that's the case. Yeah, in this house. So it's not literally in the text. So if anything, it should be in this tent, not house. In this tent we groan. Longing, and that's the word longing, where it means to lust, have this strong desire for, to be clothed with our dwelling from heaven. Now, he's switching metaphors here. He's going to be talking first about a temporary dwelling, a tent, in contrast to a permanent house. But he's also going to be using the idea of clothing, that you're clothed with a temporary dwelling, but you're actually going to be naked spiritually, and we'd rather be absent or unclothed from the body so we can be clothed with our spiritual. And so see that transition going on here, all right? So he says, we want to be clothed with our dwelling from heaven, inasmuch as having put on, we will not be found naked. Now, you help me, since you're all good Bible students, what's the implication about our current state right now in our tent, clothed with this physical body? We're naked. Isn't that what it says? We long to be clothed with our dwelling from heaven, so when we put it on, we'll not be naked. Right now, we're naked. Well, that's right. Now, naked here is generally never used in the literal sense of totally naked. It would, when that young man in Mark, where he was following Jesus and they grabbed him and he ran away naked, his outer cloak was taken away. He had his inner tunic on, but they would consider that naked. But that's how we're viewed. We're spiritually unclothed with our final body that's going to come later. Yes, Wayne. All right, okay? And that's the language here. And that's why we read in Romans 8, we groan, eagerly waiting for our adoption as sons and the redemption of our body. And so here's the next spiritual truth. Your next life is the best. Now, I've talked to Hewlin, and I've talked to other people, and it's neat to say, you know, I've had a good life. God's blessed me. I mean, isn't that all you can ask for? Abraham said, my days have been many, and my life has been a blessing. I think it was Jacob said, my days have been short and full of trouble. In contrast. Well, it's interesting because Abraham was a man of faith, and Jacob was a liar and a deceiver. Remember? He stole his son's birthright, or brother's birthright, and all sorts of problems plagued him because of that. But the best you could say is, the Lord's blessed me, and I've had a good life. Right? But you haven't seen the best life. Because what this next life is going to be like when we have our glorified body and we're living in glory, well, again, what does he say? Nothing compares. And so that's what we're looking for, this next life where we eagerly wait. So that's why he says, while indeed we're in this tent, we groan, repeating that language, because we're burdened, because we don't want to be naked or unclothed, but to be clothed so the mortal may be swallowed up by life. And that's a beautiful picture here. The word burden means weighed down, weighed down. We've got this load we're carrying, and we want to get rid of it. And so we want to strip ourselves of the garments. That's what the word unclothed means. Now, how do you get stripped? Lose your body. How is that going to happen? It's death. See, we're all embracing death here. And then he says we're going to be swallowed up by real life. Now, the word swallowed up, I think if I remember correctly, means to be destroyed or totally to drink down. And so we see death as some kind of demise or cruel end to our existence on the earth. But Paul says, no, when you die and you get unclothed of your body, that's when you get swallowed up with what? Just the opposite of the way we think. Now, how did he start this whole discussion in chapter 1? The first three words? For we know. So again, I ask the question, how many of us really know this? How many of us really think this way? Because if you did, we would be longing and groaning as well. Peter said this, knowing the laying aside of my earthly dwelling is imminent. He knew he was going to die soon, but I would just want you to see the language. It's just the laying aside of your earthly dwelling, your earthly tent. You're just laying it aside. But what about the real you? You're going to be swallowed up in life. Find yourself in the presence of God in glory. Yes, you'll be given a temporary robe, but later you'll get your eternal glorified body. He says, that's why he says, God prepared this. Now, what does that tell you? This is his plan. This is his plan from the very beginning. You talk about the mystery of the gospel. This is it. He prepared it because he knew you were going to die. But he says, don't worry, I'll take care of that even. Because it's been appointed for man to die once, then face the judgment. He says, I will deal with your death. I will take care of it. And it's actually going to be a gateway into glory. So don't worry about it. Thank you, Lord. That's why he says death is swallowed up in victory. He said, oh, death, where is thy sting? That's 1 Corinthians 15. There's no sting in death for the Christian, only for those that stay behind. But for you and me, there's no sting. We're swallowed up in life for the first time. And the Spirit is given a pledge. That's like a down payment. So when we look at it, Guzik says in modern Greek language, it's like an engagement ring. And that's what the Spirit was. God's serious about it. So here we are, tenting on this earth. I'll ask just 3 questions out of this, and just for us to think about. Am I earnestly desiring my new body? And when I say earnestly, it's just like, I just can't wait to get it. Of course, the only way I can get it is what? So am I earnestly desiring to leave this body? Because they go together, don't they? I mean, you can't get your new car unless you get rid of the old one. Well, some of us hang on to both, but, sorry, I'll get rid of it. But you can't do it with your new body. Hang on to your old one. You're trading up, right? You can't keep both. And that's what Paul says we know, and so we look for it. So do I groan to leave? Spiritually groan. I just can't wait. That's what Paul's talking about. So there's where we are now, where he says, therefore, be of good courage. That word's interesting. It means to show courage, boldness, be hopeful or confident. It's just an inner disposition. You know everything's okay because you have the Lord behind you, and it's always going to work out no matter what you do or no matter what happens, so you can be bold. That's how Paul could deal with persecution like he did, because he knows no matter what happens, I'm going to be glorified. It's win, 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 win. And that's what he's trying to get us. He says, while we're at home in the body, where are we? We're absent from the Lord. Let me ask this. What did Paul expect to happen as soon as he died? You see that? Because when we're absent from the Lord, but we're of good courage, and we prefer rather to be absent from the body so we can be what? So let me just get you to think about this. It's not you might be, or it'll happen later. You can't be in two places at the same time. If you're home in the body, you're going to be absent from the Lord. If you're absent from the body, you will be what? Home with the Lord. It happens as soon as you leave. That's what Paul expects. And when you understand that, like, really? I could be in January in the fog and 38-degree rainy weather in the valley, or I could be on the Maui beach snorkeling in 75-degree water. Now, I can't be in both places at the same time. Is that true? So what are we going to choose to do in January? Fly to Maui, right? Now, when you see it, those physical pictures, hopefully it gives you the illustration of what we're talking about. Paul says, we know this. That's why I have good courage. Take my life, fine, because I'll finally be in glory. It's just that simple. And you say, well, how do you know? Verse 7, what? We walk by faith and not by sight. How do you know you're going to get a new body? Because Jesus said so. How do you know he's preparing a place for you? All right, so faith here is not mental assent, it's trust. I know he's faithful. He's kept his word. He rose from the dead. And I know when he makes me these promises, I know it's going to happen. And so I don't see it with my physical eye, but I see it with my spiritual eye. So we walk by faith and not by sight. Now, don't use this passage to talk about your initial faith in coming to Christ. That's evidence-based, right? It's factual. It's a product of persuasion and convincing the intellect. And it's reasonable to believe that Jesus is the Christ. But now that you're a Christian and he makes these grand promises and you have this mental assent that he is faithful, what do? You trust him, unquestionably. You don't have to have a preview. You just know if he said it, you can believe it. You walk by faith and not by sight. See the difference? All right. Yes.
Well, one of the assurances I get too is the fact that Paul, when he was caught up, was able to see things he wasn't able to speak about.
Yeah.
And so that's the assurance coming from him, and that's why he speaks as boldly as he does.
Yes.
About the very thing.
And he'll talk about that later in this same book. Good. Yes.
Well, in Hebrews, that's in Hebrews 11 that we talked about that, the heroes of faith.
Yes.
Hebrews 11:6 says, without faith follows Jesus, and those who must draw near to God or please him must believe he is, and a rewarder
Warden.
of those who diligently seek him.
That's the trust factor. That's right.
That's what that is. And then it goes on to talk about Abraham sacrificing Isaac, knew that he could do it because he had the trust in God that even if I kill him, he'll bring him back.
Raised from the dead. Yeah. Because he trusted God would keep his promise. All right. Here it means to go abroad. Absent, it means to depart or live abroad. That's what he's talking about. You have to leave this world to live in the heavenly. So our spiritual truth, our third one, heaven's our real home. I just want to think about it. It's our real home. This is a temporary home. We're tenting or camping for a little while. All right, we're done, but I'll just introduce this. What's our ambition now while we're waiting? No. To be pleasing. And that includes our work. But our goal is, okay, I'm here for a little while, and while I'm waiting, what's my only ambition? I'll leave you this word ambition. It's a word, the philo, which is love. It's a love of time, which is a word of honor. You're an honor-seeking person. If you have any decency, any honor in you, and you strive to please God and show him respect, you're going to want to please him in all you do. Considering what he's done and who he is and what he's now going to do for you, if you're a lover of honor, you'll desire to please him as you walk on this earth. All right, we'll stop right there. Thank you.